The dust of the Llano Estacado was not like other dust. It was a fine, relentless powder that seeped into everything. The seams of a calico dress, the cracks of sun-bleached wood, the lines of a weary face. It coated the world in a pale, thirsty film. Eliza Gable knew this dust better than she knew her own reflection. At 24, she moved through the sprawling confines of Fort Concho like a ghost in her own life, a woman etched not by laughter or love, but by the abrasive grit of disappointment. Her father, a stern career officer, saw her plain features and quiet manner as a personal failing. Her mother, long faded into illness and regret, had whispered the defining word on her deathbed, a word that had settled on Eliza's soul as permanently as the dust. Unlovable. It was not spoken with malice, but with a heartbreaking resignation that made it truth. Eliza's engagement to Lieutenant Peter Shaw was a transaction of convenience, a strategic alignment for a man on the rise. He was handsome, ambitious, and when he looked at her, his eyes held the same appraisal he gave a new saddle, assessment of utility, absent of warmth. Her world was a small, fenced square of prairie under a vast, uncaring sky, a life of muted colors and quieter sorrows, where the most savage thing she could imagine was the endless stretch of her own future. All that changed on a Tuesday morning when the horizon turned into a nightmare. A hunting party, meant to be a brief respite from the fort's stifling atmosphere, was shattered by a force that moved like a storm made of flesh and fury. Comanche warriors, painted for war, descended with a speed that turned the air into a chaos of screams, gunshots, and thunderous hoofs. In the blinding violence, Eliza was ripped from her horse. The world became a jumble of sky and ground, the smell of blood and sweat, the terrifying feel of hard-muscled arms binding her. She saw Peter's face for a final instant, not a hero's determined snarl, but a man calculating survival, his horse already wheeling away. He did not look back. As she was thrown across the back of a painted pony, the last thread connecting her to her old life was not love or loyalty, but the sound of her fiancé's retreat. The fort vanished behind a curtain of dust. The savage had taken her body, but Peter Shaw, with his cowardice, had confirmed the branding on her soul. She was indeed unworthy of any love, even the desperate, dutiful kind. The journey was a baptism in terror and endurance. Bound, gagged, and utterly disoriented, Eliza was carried across a landscape that seemed to have no end. The Comanche, the Numinu, were not men as she understood them. They were elements of the plain itself, flowing with the hills, silent as shadows, then loud as cracking stone. Her captor was a man named Tutsinoyu, or Hawk circling the sun. He said nothing to her. His eyes, when they flicked to her, held no cruelty, but a cold, distant observation, as if she were a strange bird he had netted. The band moved with an efficiency that spoke of a deep, ancient knowledge. They ate strips of dried meat, drank from hidden seeps, and slept under stars so bright they felt like a physical weight. Eliza's fear slowly calcified into a numb certainty. This was to be her death, a hard, anonymous death under the merciless sun, a final proof of her insignificance. They rode into the heart of Comancheria, a hidden village nestled along a creek lined with cottonwoods. It was a scene of alien vitality. Buffalo hides stretched on frames, dogs and children weaving through lanes, the rich smell of burning cedar and roasting meat. Eliza was pulled from the horse and thrown to the ground in the center of a gathering crowd. Faces curious and hard surrounded her. Women pulled at her hair, her dress, speaking in quick, sharp tones. She was a thing, a piece of plunder. An older woman, her face a map of stern lines, stepped forward. This was Quinai, Hawk's mother. She issued a command, and a bucket of icy creek water was thrown over Eliza. As she sputtered, her travel-stained dress was stripped away and replaced with a simple, smoked soft deerskin shift. The humiliation was total, a stripping not just of cloth, but of every vestige of the woman she had been. She was given a task immediately, to tend to a simmering pot of broth under Quinai's watchful eye. Her first fumbling attempt with the hot stones used for boiling earned her a sharp slap on the wrist. The message was clear. Here, she was tupu, a captive. Her value was her labor or her lack of it. That night, curled on a thin pallet in Quinai's lodge, listening to the foreign cadence of a language and the howl of prairie wolves, Eliza felt a despair so complete it was almost peaceful. The branding was now literal. She was property. The savage had freed her from one prison only to place her in another, and this one felt infinitely more final. The days bled into a rhythm of exhausting work. She hauled water, scraped hides until her fingers bled, gathered firewood under the watchful eyes of children assigned to guard her. She was mocked for her weakness, her pale skin that reddened and blistered under the sun. The name they gave her was whispered with disdain. Pia Mua, water without spirit, lifeless and flat. Hawk was often gone, hunting or raiding. When he was present, he paid her little direct mind, though she felt his gaze like a physical touch, a constant, unsettling assessment. One afternoon, while struggling to move a heavy parfleche, Quinai snapped at her in frustration. Eliza, pushed past her limit by hunger, fatigue, and the weight of her grief, did something she had never done before. She looked the old woman in the eye, and with a voice hoarse from disuse, she said a single Comanche word she had learned. Ha, wait. Then, using a piece of hide as a lever, she demonstrated a simpler way to drag the load. Quinai fell silent, her eyes narrowing. She said nothing but turn away. Later, Eliza's meager meal had a small piece of fatty marrow added to it. It was not kindness. It was an acknowledgement the barest flicker. That night, Hawk returned. As he passed the fire where Eliza sat, he paused. He looked from the marrow bone in her hand to her face. For the first time, his expression was not one of cold observation. It was a spark of curiosity, quickly veiled. He moved on, but the air felt different. The cage of her existence had not changed, but a single, silent bar had been noted. Perhaps water without spirit held a faint, unseen current beneath its placid surface. The seasons on the high plains did not gentle into one another. They fought for dominance in sudden, violent shifts. A warm morning could be slain by a blue norther screaming down from the north by afternoon. Eliza, now called Pia Muha by all, learned this in her bones. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused maps of her labor. Her skin had toughened and darkened. She understood the tasks now, the precise angle to scrape a hide to softness, the plants good for tea or tannin, the way to bank a fire for the long night. Survival had become a habit, a series of motions that left little room for the luxury of self-pity. Quinai remained a stern taskmaster, but the sharp slaps had ceased. Her instructions were now given in short, direct phrases, and Eliza began to stitch the language together. She learned that Pia was water, Tuka was buffalo, Quana was wood. The world began to rename itself around her, slowly shedding the English labels of her past. Hawk was a constant, unsettling presence. He was a pillar of the band, respected for his prowess in hunting and war, but he carried a quiet intensity that set him apart even among his own people. He was not given to the loud storytelling or boasting of some other men. He watched. He listened. His eyes missed nothing. One evening, a young, brash warrior named Wolftail made a crude joke about the white captive, suggesting she was ready to be taken as a wife since no one else seemed to want her. The laughter around the fire died instantly as Hawk, without a word, slowly turned his gaze upon the younger man. He didn't stand, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Wolftail dropped his eyes and muttered an apology. Hawk's claim on her was unspoken, but understood. She was his tupu, and his alone. The incident confused Eliza. It wasn't protection she felt in that moment, but the primal tension of ownership like a wolf guarding a kill. Yet, It was the first time anyone had ever asserted any claim over her at all. A turning point came with the illness. A fever swept through the children of the band, a dry, coughing sickness that stole their strength. Quinai's youngest granddaughter, a bright-eyed girl named Little Bird, fell desperately ill. The healer worked with herbs and songs, but the child worsened. Memories of her own mother's long, fading illness surfaced in Eliza. The helplessness, the quiet vigil. One memory, a folk remedy from her grandmother, whispered at the edge of her mind. With gestures and broken words, she approached Quinai. She asked for mint for a pot of steam. Desperation overrode suspicion. Quinai, her face etched with fear, allowed it. For 2 days and nights, Eliza barely slept. She kept a steam tent over the child, infused with mint she found by the creek, constantly wiping the little girl's brow with cool cloths. She sang, not Comanche songs, but the old, half-remembered lullabies of her own childhood. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Little Bird opened her eyes, weak but clear. Quinai, who had not left the lodge, looked from her granddaughter to Eliza. She did not smile, but she placed a hand, rough and warm, on Eliza's arm for a long moment. That evening, Eliza's place by the fire was closer to the family's heart. The food she was given was the same as the family's. The barrier of tupu had not dissolved, but it had grown porous. Hawk observed this change. He began to speak to her, not at her. His words were simple at first, naming objects, actions. Tuka, he would say, pointing to the buffalo robe. Yinu, for the saddle. She became his student, and he a patient, exacting teacher. One afternoon, he took her from the village, alone. Her heart hammered, unsure of his intent. He led her to a high, wind-scoured bluff overlooking an endless sea of grass. He didn't touch her. He simply pointed. Tunu Sukabitu, he said. The people's country. He spoke then, in slow, carefully chosen words she could grasp, of the spirit of the land, of the puha that flowed through the buffalo, the wolf, the eagle, and the grass itself. He spoke not of owning it, but of belonging to it. The Tejano and the Igbo, he said, using the words for Spaniard and American, they cut the land. They build their boxes. They do not hear it sing. They are Pia Muha to the earth. He used her name, but not as an insult, as a description of a state of being. He turned to her, his dark eyes holding hers. You learn to hear the song. Your spirit is not dead. It is lost, like a calf in a canyon. In that moment, under the immense sky, Eliza felt the branding of unlovable begin to crack. He did not see a ghost or a thing. He saw a lost calf. It was the first true acknowledgement of her inner self, however misplaced, she had ever received. She was not being seen for her utility or her failure. She was being seen as a living entity adrift. On the ride back, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the hum of the prairie and the echo of his words. Back in the village, the change was cemented in an unexpected way. A group of warriors returned from a raid far to the south, bringing with them 2 Mexican captive women and a handful of horses. The village gathered to see the new plunder. One of the women, wild-eyed with terror, was roughly pushed forward. Her eyes swept the crowd and landed on Eliza, the white face in the deerskin dress. She cried out in Spanish, pleading for help, assuming a shared bond of blood and captivity. Every eye turned to Eliza. This was a test she hadn't anticipated. The woman reached for her. Eliza looked at her, saw the reflection of her own initial terror. But then she looked past her to Quinai's stoic face, to Little Bird peeking from behind her grandmother's skirts, to Hawk, watching intently from across the circle. She did not see her people. She saw the faces of the life that, for better or worse, she now inhabited. She took a small step back, away from the pleading woman. She said nothing. The action was a whisper, but in the social fabric of the camp, it was a thunderclack. She had chosen a side. She had, in that silent step, renounced her old world. Later, Hawk came to her as she worked. He didn't praise her. He simply handed her a finely beaded awl case, a tool of value and use. For PMUha, he said, and his voice carried a new timbre. Who begins to hear the grass? The beaded all case was not a trinket. It was a key. It unlocked a subtle but profound shift in Eliza's position within the band. She was no longer merely a captive who worked, but a person who contributed. Women began to ask for her help with intricate beadwork, having noticed her careful, patient hands. She learned to sew the delicate patterns that told stories on moccasins and cradleboards. Her old life, that shuttered room of disappointment at Fort Concho, felt like a story she had been told about someone else. The language flowed more freely into her now, painting her thoughts in new colors. She found herself thinking in Comanche, dreaming in its rhythms. The name Pia Mua no longer felt like an insult, but a name. Her spirit, once still and flat, was now stirred by the wind of this hard, beautiful existence. Hawk's lessons moved from the practical to the profound. He taught her to ride not side-saddle on a placid mare, but astride a spirited pony, becoming one creature with the animal, feeling its intentions through her knees and the shift of its muscles. They would ride for miles, and he showed her how to read the land, the meaning of a bent blade of grass, the story in a wolf's track, the hidden water beneath a dry creek bed. One day, they came upon a small herd of pronghorn. He handed her his bow, a weapon she had only ever seen used by men. The land provides, he said quietly, but you must be worthy of the gift. Your arm must be clear, your hand steady. Your spirit must ask permission of the animal spirit. Her hands trembled. She thought of the lieutenant's hunting parties, the loud guns, and boastful tallying of kills. This was different, sacred. She missed the arrow flying wide. The pronghorn bounded away. She expected derision. Instead, Hawk nodded. Your spirit was not ready. It was honest. He retrieved the arrow. To kill without respect is to steal. To steal from a land is to starve your own soul. In that moment, she understood the vast gulf between the savage the soldiers feared and the man who stood beside her. His was a savage grace, a code of life bound in reciprocity, not domination. This new understanding was violently tested. A war party returned, not in triumph, but in grim, bloody silence. They had clashed with U.S. cavalry scouts. Among the wounded was Hawk's close friend, a man called Bear Walking. A soldier's bullet was lodged deep in his chest. The healer worked, but the wound festered. The mood in the camp was heavy, a mixture of grief and simmering rage. Hawk spent long hours by his friend's side, his face a mask of stone. One night, as Bear Walking's breathing grew ragged, Hawk came to Eliza's sleeping place. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from tears, but from a fire that burned within. You know their medicine, he said, a statement, not a question. He meant the medicine of the white world. She protested, saying she was no doctor. You are of their world, he insisted, his voice low and urgent. You have seen their wounds. Help him. It was a command, but beneath it was a raw, desperate plea. It was the first time he had ever asked her for anything. Terrified, Eliza approached the dying man. The smell of the wound was foul. She remembered snippets from the fort's surgeon, the importance of clean instruments, of boiling water, of draining pus. With halting words, she instructed Quinai and the other women. She asked for the sharpest knife to be held in the fire, for clean cloths, for a broth of certain herbs she knew had cleansing properties. The healer watched suspicious but did not interfere. Under Eliza's direction, they reopened the wound to drain it. She cleaned it with the boiled water and herb mixture. Her hands, so steady with beadwork, shook as she worked, but she did not stop. She bound it with the cleanest dressings they could make. For days, she tended to Bear Walking, changing the poultices, forcing broth between his lips. Hawk was always there, watching a silent, intense presence. Slowly, impossibly, the fever receded. The wound began to close cleanly. Bear Walking would live, though he would carry a deep scar. The news spread through the village like a cleansing rain. Eliza had not used magic. She had used knowledge from the world they despised, and it had saved one of their own. The night Bear Walking sat up, and ate solid food, a celebration was held. It was not a grand feast, but a solemn gathering of gratitude. The healer, an old man with eyes like clouded quartz, stood and spoke. He acknowledged the spirit of the white captive, Pia Muha, who had brought wisdom from an unexpected place. He called it strong Puha. Then Hawk stood. He spoke not of medicine, but of bridges. A person can walk two paths, he said, his voice carrying in the firelight. One path is of their birth. One path is of their heart. Pia Muha was born on one side of the river. She now walks on this side. She has used stones from the old path to build a bridge for us. He then turned to Eliza, and in front of the entire band, he did something extraordinary. He removed a necklace from around his own neck, a single, polished bear claw on a thin strip of leather. It was a personal talisman, a piece of his own puha. He walked over and placed it around her neck. The leather was warm from his skin. "You are not Tupu," he declared, the word final and absolute. "You are Namunu of the people. Your heart walks our path." The act was not a romantic gesture. It was a claim far deeper than the claim of a captor. He had claimed her soul for his people, and in doing so, had freed her from the last chains of her old life. As the claw rested against her chest, Eliza felt the final seal on the branding Unlovable shatter and fall away. It was not replaced with a declaration of love, but with something more foundational, belonging. She was real. She was Comanche. The bear claw was not jewelry. It was a weight, a cool, smooth truth against her skin. To be Namunu was not a pardon from work, but an invitation into a deeper responsibility. Eliza, who had once been a ghost, now had a shadow that stretched long in the morning sun, intertwined with the shadows of others. She was given a lodge of her own, a small but sturdy teepee next to Quinai's. It was not a gift, but an acknowledgement of her adult status. She was expected to manage it, to keep its stores, to contribute to the band's wealth. She learned to pack the travois for moves with swift efficiency, understanding now that each item had its place in the song of movement across the plains. She joined the women in the brutal, exhilarating work of the buffalo hunt's aftermath, the skinning, the butchering, the rendering, the endless smoking of meat. Her hands moved in rhythm with the others, no longer clumsy but sure and strong. The blood that coated her arms to the elbows felt like a baptism into life itself, not a chore. Her relationship with Hawk transformed into a quiet, potent alliance. The unspoken claim had been spoken. He did not court her in the stilted, formal way of officers' wives at the fort. Their courtship was in shared silence on a high ridge, in the efficient way they worked together to break a wild pony, in the trust of him leaving his most valuable possessions in her lodge for safekeeping when he was away. One evening, as they sat by her fire, he spoke of his vision quest as a youth, of the hawk that had circled the sun until they seemed to merge, and how the spirit had told him he would find strength not in taking, but in seeing what others could not. "I saw you," he said simply, stirring the embers with a stick. "Not a white woman, not a captive, a piece of flint dropped in the wrong canyon, useless where it lay. But strike it right." He looked at her, and the firelight danced in his dark eyes. "It makes a spark that can start a prairie fire." It was the closest he had come to speaking of love, and it was a language far more terrifying and real than any poetry Peter Shaw might have mumbled. It spoke of potential, of power, of a destiny intertwined. This new life, however, existed under a darkening sky. Rumors came with traders and refugees from other bands. The Igbo were coming in numbers like the grasshoppers, building iron roads across the hunting grounds, slaughtering the buffalo herds not for food or life, but for sport and hides to sell. Tension was a constant hum. Scouts were always out. The joy in the village became more fierce, more precious, as if everyone knew they were savoring the last days of a great feast. Eliza felt this tension in a uniquely double-edged way. The threat was to her people now, to Hawk, to Quinai, to Little Bird. But she also knew the mind of the enemy in a way the others did not. She knew the relentless, grinding machinery of the American will the way it saw land as lines on a map, and people as obstacles to be removed. She tried to explain this to Hawk, the concept of an endless supply of men and bullets and an indifference so vast it was its own kind of weapon. He listened, his face grave. The puha of their chief is a hungry ghost, he concluded. It can never be filled. We cannot feed it. We must break its teeth. The teeth came snapping sooner than any wished. A dawn raid by cavalry on a smaller allied camp sent a ripple of fury and fear through Comanche. Retaliation was swift and brutal. Hawk rode out with the war party, his face painted for death. The days he was gone were the longest of Eliza's life. She waited with the other women, her anxiety a cold stone in her belly. When they returned, it was with a grim victory. Horses, scalps, but also new losses. And they brought prisoners, 2 young, terrified cavalry soldiers, boys really, their blue uniforms torn and stained. The village's grief turned into a raging hunger for vengeance. A council was called. Voices rose, demanding torture, a slow death to appease the spirits of their own dead. Eliza's blood ran cold. She saw the faces of the boys, one freckled, no older than 16, and she saw the faces of the young lieutenants from Fort Concho. They were the enemy, but they were also pitiful, broken symbols of the world that had branded her. As the debate grew heated, Hawk stood. He spoke of strength, of the proper way to treat a captive enemy. But the rage in the camp was a living thing. Then, to Eliza's horror, Quinai stood, her voice like cracking ice. She had lost a brother in the dawn attack. She pointed a bony finger at Eliza. We have one of theirs among us. Let her speak. Let the woman who was once Igbo tell us how they would treat our warriors if they were caught. Then we will know what is just. All eyes burned into Eliza. This was the ultimate test, far beyond choosing a side during a captive's plea. This was to pronounce a sentence. Hawk looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had claimed her soul for the people. Now, the people demanded she prove its allegiance was complete. She rose, her legs weak. She walked to the center, near where the 2 soldiers shivered. She looked at their faces, then at the hardened, grieving faces of her band. She thought of Bear walking saved. She thought of Little Bird's life spared. She thought of the bare claw on her chest, and of Hawk's words about the hungry ghost. She spoke, her voice clear and carrying in the hushed circle. They would put them in a dark hole, she said in Comanche. They would feed them poor food until their spirits sickened. They would make them dig like prairie dogs until their backs broke. Then they would send them far away across the great water, to a place of stone, to die alone, never seeing their sky again. She paused, letting the image of this slow, spiritual death sink in. A quick death is a warrior's death. It is a gift. The death they give is for Piamuha, for those without spirit. It is the death of the hungry ghost. Do we want their ghost in our camp? The silence was absolute. She had not argued for mercy. She had framed a quick execution not as weakness, but as a cultural superiority, a cleaner, more honorable path. She had used the white world's own cruel logic against itself. The headman grunted, considering. He looked at Hawk, who gave a single, slow nod. The woman speaks true, the headman said. We are not Igbo. We will not catch their sickness of the soul. Let them die as warriors under the sun. The sentence was still death, but it was swift. As the prisoners were led away, Quinai met Eliza's gaze. There was no approval there, but a deep, weary respect. The bridge Hawk spoke of had just borne the weight of life and death, and it had held. The seasons turned, but the turn felt different now. It was not a cycle, but a tightening spiral. The buffalo grew scarce, their great, dark herds splintering into frightened, scattered fragments. The grass where the villages once stood was now scarred with wagon ruts and the stumps of felled trees. The Igbo were no longer a distant rumor or a seasonal enemy. They were a constant, oppressive presence on the edges of their world, a slow, tightening noose of forts, settlements, and soldiers. The people moved more frequently, their camps hidden in deeper canyons, their scouts watching the horizons with a perpetual hawk-like intensity. Joy became a guarded, fleeting thing, seized in moments between the clouds of worry. Eliza, now fully Numenu in dress, speech, and spirit, carried the tension in the set of her shoulders and the quickness of her glances. She had found a love more profound than any she had imagined, a love for a man, for a people, for a way of being, and she could feel it being threatened with extinction. Her union with Hawk was not a ceremony of words, but of action. One morning, as the band prepared to move to a spring camp, he simply led his best horses to the front of her lodge and tied them there. He then moved his bow, his shield, and his bedroll inside. Quinai came and presented Eliza with a beautifully quilled dress she had made herself. That was all. She was his wife. That night, in the privacy of their lodge, he touched the bare claw at her throat, then his own chest where it had once rested. "My pa has been with you for a long time," he said. "Now the rest of me follows." Their love was a fierce, quiet fortification against the dying of the light. He taught her to shoot his rifle, a prized repeating Winchester taken in a raid. "The time for only bows is passing," he said, his voice heavy. "You must be able to defend our home if I am not here." She learned, her jaw set with a determination that would have been foreign to the woman from Fort Concho. She was no longer protecting just herself. She was protecting a world. The end, when it came, was not a glorious battle, but a slow, suffocating surrender. A delegation from the U.S. government, accompanied by a small army of bluecoats, found their hidden canyon. They came under a white flag, speaking of a great council, of a reservation where the people could live in peace, where they would be given food and blankets. The headmen listened, their faces like stone. Eliza, standing with the women, translated the honeyed words, but she also translated the unspoken truth in the soldiers' stances, the sheer number of them encircling the camp. She saw the desperate hope in some of the older faces worn down by hunger and constant flight. She saw the furious defiance in the eyes of the warriors, Hawks among them. The agent pointedly noted the presence of a white woman, calling her Miss and offering her safe return to her own kind. All eyes fell on her. Hawk's hand tightened on his rifle. Eliza stepped forward. She looked the agent directly in the eye and spoke in clear English, her voice ringing out in the shocked silence. "I am with my own kind." She then turned and repeated her words in Comanche for her people. A ripple went through the band. The agent's face hardened. The choice was presented: come peacefully to the reservation, or be hunted down and destroyed. The band was divided, weak from hunger, outnumbered. With hearts crushed under the weight of an inevitable tide, the headman agreed to go. The journey to the reservation was a funeral procession for a way of life. The people were herded like cattle across a land that was once theirs. At the reservation, a barren, dusty patch of earth surrounded by fences and the eyes of soldiers, the soul-crushing work of assimilation began. The men were forced to cut their hair, to take up plows that broke against the hard ground. The children were taken to a school where they were beaten for speaking their language. The Poho was being systematically strangled. Hawk withered. The man who was Hawk circling the sun became a shadow, his eyes dull, his spirit caged. He would sit for hours, staring at the horizon beyond the fence. Eliza fought the dying of his light. She reminded him of the spark of the prairie fire. She kept their lodge as a sanctuary, speaking only Comanche, making the old foods as best she could with the wretched government rations. She became a quiet rebel, a keeper of the flame. One day, a new Indian agent arrived, a younger man with a bureaucratic air. He reviewed the rolls and discovered Eliza's presence. He summoned her. Hawk, sensing danger, went with her, standing like a sentinel at her back. The agent offered her freedom, papers, a train ticket back east, a pension as a rescued captive. "You have suffered a great ordeal, Mrs. Gable," he said, consulting his ledger. "You can be made whole again." Eliza looked at the man, then at Hawk, whose face was a mask of stoic despair, believing he was about to watch his heart walk away. She thought of the hungry ghost, still offering its empty gifts. She thought of the branding that had been seared away, not by kindness, but by a savage, freeing truth. She picked up the agent's pen from his desk. She did not sign his papers. Instead, she slowly, deliberately drew a line through the name Eliza Gable on his ledger. Then, she turned to her husband. "You Puni Hutsu?" she asked. "Shall we go home?" She did not mean the reservation shack. She meant them. A flicker, like the last ember of a great fire, ignited in Hawk's eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. They walked out, past the agent's sputtered protests, past the fences, back to their small patch of defiance. That night, under a sky obscured by the haze of the reservation's dust, they lay together in their lodge. The world outside was conquered, their future bleak. But inside a small, untamed space remained. Hawk touched her face, tracing the lines the sun and wind had carved, lines of laughter and grief that were their shared history. "They took the land," he whispered, his voice rough. "They took the buffalo. They put my body in a cage." His hand moved to rest over her heart, where the bare claw lay. "But they did not find this canyon. They did not take my flint, my spark." Eliza covered his hand with her own. The savage who had freed her from a life of loveless oblivion had not just claimed her soul. He had given her his own in return. They were each other's captive and liberator, a fortress of two in a fallen world. The branding was gone, forever. In its place was a bond forged in the savage, beautiful truth of a love that had heard the grass sing and would remember its song until the very last star winked out.